what I'm going to go into is introduce myself and talk about where the state of finance is today, what it does at a modern organization. I'll then talk about some of the tooling, both the history of it and where it has evolved to today. And then I'll talk a little bit about where we have some early hypotheses and some opportunities that could be interesting to anybody in this room. A little bit about me. I started my career at Morgan Stanley directly serving the FP&A team. I thought that I would, 10 years later, be the most famous person in this photo, but actually I'm not. Does anybody know who the points guy is? The influencer, like the credit card influencer,
Yeah.
Points guy? That is the points guy. He outshone all of us, and he entered a career. This was his last month at Morgan Stanley. He then went on to become the points guy. At the time, he was like, "Hey, I'm quitting my job to talk about credit cards." None of us expected him to blow up in this way. But anyways, this is kind of a class at Morgan Stanley that I was part of. I was an engineer there for 2 years. I worked for that cat over here, and then I also worked at and co-founded a company called Soups, and there I met actually my co-founder, Zishan. He's based in New York, so he couldn't be here, but he was engineer number one at my previous startup. We hit it off, and we've both been exploring this space together. So what do you guys think of when you think of finance and accounting? What are the words and the tools that jump in to your head? Excel, yes. What else? Ledgers, yeah.
Yeah, say entries, reports.
Entries, reports, line items, maybe. What else? Budgets, yeah. And the role of finance today, and I'll go into what it's going to evolve to, but that's mostly the case in the modern organization. This is a pyramid, a graph created by Andreessen, but it kind of talks about the different layers that are involved in finance. At its most basic, you have accounting, which is basically having your ledger and keeping track of all the transactions that happen in your organization. It moves up to record keeping, and some of the motives here include regulatory reasons. If you work in a heavily regulated field, you are actually by law, you need to have your numbers and you need to report them in a real-time way. I just spoke to a founder of a financial planning tool in biotech, and there's a unique need there because the FDA actually needs to know how your company is doing as it's going through clinical trials. There's also reporting and compliance, and everybody has an accountant here. Books are meant to be closed quarterly or every so often, and then finally it moves up to financial planning. And this to me has been some of the most interesting part of the pyramid, because it starts to go to and influence your just direction and outlook as a company. Some of the questions that we've heard e-commerce people ask themselves is like, "Hey, I'm a pet food company. I did so-and-so amount of sales in my last Black Friday. How are my sales going to look in my next Black Friday?" And you can imagine there's a host of inputs to that economic model. It's not just the cost of your raw materials changing, but also external events. Maybe your Instagram and your Twitter following has grown. How do you account for that? How do you model that? And that's been the pull for both Zishan and I in this world, is how do you take such a complex piece of reality and give people at least some sort of hint and nudge on what it could be? Does anybody know the story behind strategic finance and how it started at Dropbox? In 2014, Dropbox started the Office of Strategic Finance, and they gave it a much different mandate than past finance offices. They said, you're going to play offense rather than defense. You're going to pursue M&A and find other companies that make sense in the Dropbox portfolio. They said you're going to play offense and get data from inside the company and use that to drive go-to-market, use that to drive product. This was unheard of at the time. And the CEO and two finance people started this office, And they redefined the role of finance so much that it's not called strategic finance anymore. That's how any modern finance organization at a Series B plus startup works. And that was a huge moment, and it's still the ripples are still being felt. But one of our early hypotheses is that in this new reality, what tooling makes sense for that new world. No longer are people in the Office of Finance just consuming these numbers. No longer are they the only audience. Now this is suddenly a very huge multiplayer game inside of an organization where go-to-market is consuming these numbers and head of product is consuming these numbers. So these are just open questions that we have started to think out loud about. In this new world of strategic finance, what does the tooling look like? How does it fit in that world? Any questions or comments so far? This is a case study. Segments, you can read it, but the bottom line is that the finance professionals went into territory that they normally don't go at. They looked at the numbers and they dove into the problem, engaged with engineers, engaged with product, and spun up a solution that ultimately helped them save a lot of cost and increase their margins. This is like a kind of a fiefdom, a sort of team that's like expanding and putting its tentacles into other parts of the organization. It wasn't really heard of at the time. And that's where finance is going. Finance is becoming more and more, they're sitting in the driver's seat more and more often. It's not a surprise that when a lot of CEOs leave, the CFO comes in. That's not by coincidence. They're often the best people to know kind of the outlook over the organization and to drive it moving forward. Obviously, there's a lot of opinions there as an engineer. I think product and engineering should be involved in that, but this exploring this world has changed some of those beliefs. And so let's talk about tooling for a second. And I lean a lot on contrary capitalist research here, which I know some of you guys are very familiar with. Act 1, it was Excel. That was the dominant tool on-prem. And this was the world that served the old finance reality of doing accounting, doing taxes, checking off your regulatory duties on a very predictable basis. Act 2 was taking these tools and bringing them into the cloud, and this is where companies like Anaplan, Planful, Workday Adaptive were born. What they seized on is, well, this all lives in silos across many people's different computers and machines. We're going to bring it into the cloud so that people have one common place to collaborate and see the numbers. Act 3 was more point solutions. There are, just like there are for ERPs, there's a host of FP&A tooling that serves every vertical that you could think out there. There's one for biotech, there's one for e-commerce, it's the same story with ERPs heard again. And you're starting to see that shift I talked about of CFOs taking a more active hand in their business. And I would really want to underwrite that. If CFOs are taking a more active hand in their business, what tooling does one provide them to best do that? And then we know the story with growth in data and what propelled companies like Snowflake. There's just so much more that's being captured, so much more that's being stored, and the FP&A team has to do a lot more with the same old tools that they've had. And the last act are these new upstarts that are coming up. You guys have heard of Causal, you've probably heard of Runway. They're taking they're exploring some very interesting things, a lot of which that's echoed in some of the points I'm talking about. I think Runway has a really interesting vision around creating and modeling your entire business in one place, taking models that are made in this team and that team and really consolidating it together. I think there's a little bit of hand-waviness going on there, but that's their vision, which is really compelling. And finance is no longer seen as an output. I want to say that over and over again. Finance is no longer seen as an output. It's no longer something that's sitting on the edge of a company. It's driving it. It's sitting right in the middle. Has anybody used any of these tools besides Excel in this room?
Nope.
It's nightmares over and over again from a UI and a UX point of view. Think of like the best UI circa the late 90s, and that's what's being used today. It's a ton of overloaded GUIs with drop downs to like turtles all the way down type of thing with drop downs. And it's not intuitive, often to the point where you will be sold a service contract, a mandatory service contract, because you need somebody to help you learn the tool. Yeah. Imagine that. Imagine if Slack charged you for education to learn Slack, or Dropbox did the same. That's what all of these companies do, and they get away with it. Excel is probably the biggest competitor here. And what I mean by that is everyone is ingrained to it. It's a very natural habit. More than that, it's a safe space. Excel is the safest space you can get to if you're a finance professional. And a big piece of winning this world, in my opinion, is getting the skeptical in that world across to your world. And that's not easy. These are some of the bets we're exploring. I welcome your critique of them. Financial models are code. They're embodiment of logic, but they're not stored as code. They're not collaborated as code. They're not even commented or viewed as code. They're stored in spreadsheets and in databases and sometimes in these meta programming languages, and they shouldn't be. And so one bet we're exploring is, what if you were very thoughtful about storing my financial models in code and representing them as code from the outset? Because then if you could, then you have a huge corpus of code to train on, and we know how that story evolves with Copilot, etc. If somebody is creating a financial model to predict sales in the next quarter for a pet food company over here, then there's no reason why somebody over here who's doing a similar exercise shouldn't be able to benefit. As I said earlier, in this new world, financial tooling should sit in the middle, but it doesn't. Right now, only people in finance consume it. I don't think that's going to stick around for much longer. I think these new tools should be hyper collaborative in the same way that Figma is, in the same way that Dropbox is, where you see a huge open viewport and you see everybody hovering around over the numbers, changing them, editing them as you go. And lastly, and I have to imagine DOS feels this way and others, the age of finance software, ERP software, whatever, what have you, should start to look like consumer software. All of us love Slack and Dropbox and these other tools for a reason. And one of them is they're playful, they're fun. There's no reason why finance software should look like that either. This is us. We welcome your feedback, your critique. This can be either be done here or DM us. We are actively learning. We have some hypotheses in mind, and we're securing some design partners, but we have a way to go, and we welcome your feedback and critique. That's it.
Do you want to go back to the bets thing? I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah.
The only thing you were saying though is like we actually designed pretty much everything the exact opposite on number 3 is like the language with which we talk about the product and the way that we present it to customers is that making things look like consumer software make them feel like it's not, like you said, the safe space for critical business operations. It's like rounded edges mean you're gonna fuck up my money. Don't do that. Like, you know, it's like square everything. Like, you know,
No confetti.
No confetti. Windows 95 UI. Like, you have to meet their expectations of reality. That's the only thing that it was an interesting piece. Was I think Arnav could probably like look back at our original like code. We have our rounded radius variable slowly over time, like 8 pixels, 6 pixels, 4 pixels, 2 pixels, just keeps going down. But it's like, you know, emblematic of the bigger point, which is like we kind of have to make them feel like it's the thing that they're comparing it to in their mind. Is like, oh, it should feel like NetSuite, therefore, you know, it should look and feel a certain way, and we have to meet them at that point. Maybe over time we can, you know, but yeah.
This happened to us when building Silo. We built a few screens that were just very eye candy.
Yeah.
And people came back and they were like, no, give me God mode.
Yeah.
Where I can see, I don't want facets, I don't want steps, and I don't want rounded borders. Just give me a big ass table that I can scroll, and then the buttons, make them blue and make them big and like square.
Yeah.
And it ended up, and it's funny, even when building the accounting function of the product, they were like, no, don't build me faceted searches or anything. I just want to see the ledger.
Yeah.
Which was kind of interesting.
So like, just nested table, no grids, just slap it all in there.
The most terrifying screen for us was like our users' like favorite screen, which was like real time metrics on like harvests and like lots, which have tons of like nested tables and like stuff
Yeah. Someone we talked to about this, one of our advisors, she was on that strategic finance team at Dropbox. She reported to the CFO. She was like on the team that took them public. And prior to that, she was a VP at NetSuite for like 12 years. And her whole thing about this is like, you're building like pro tools for professionals. And it's like the way that, do you guys know how like people who are in construction get really opinionated about what tools they use? It's like, are you a Craftsman or like DeWalt or Milwaukee? And it's like, it's the same thing among these people. They have like a lot of, like the way it looks and feels and what it matches to matters a ton to them. And it's like, oh, I'm an accounting professional. I would never put red in my spreadsheet. Like, you must use parentheses to indicate that it's negative. If you don't do that, you're an idiot, you know? And like, that's the kind of stuff that, you know, they don't care that it looks cool. They want it to like match what they think is right. It's really weird. Yeah.
I think there's a separation between what look and feel is like versus bloat.
Yeah.
I think it's the bloat part that needs to be fixed. You know, these existing tools, the look and feel. I agree. Like people, especially with tools that makes them get their shit done, they don't want it to come anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
So I feel identified because I feel like, so the building the FP&A function at our previous company was incredibly complicated. We decided to build a starting series B, almost C, I think. And one of the first obstacles that we run into was, by that time we had multiple business lines or multiple revenue lines, which was already complicated to begin with. But one of the complexities was that we were doing a lot of credit and lending, which complicated a lot, just the capital structure of the company and FP&A. But the hardest part was actually like, once we hired the people that knew how to do FP&A, then the hardest part was like, what are the questions we actually want to ask? It wasn't so much answering them and building dashboards and building the models and the projections, but more like, what do we want to know? What is important to us? And that was like 95% product driven. And so then the next task became, how do we create this motion by which our head of finance at the time who's our FP&A person, was like talking to product managers, talking to engineers, understanding how did the product work? How did we make money? Like, how to prioritize different efforts? And sort of create this like matrix structure in the company where you had like sales, product, engineering, but at the same time, the efforts were like cross department in a way, because if you just look at budgets on a department basis, you're just missing the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And it was a nightmare. It took us months to do it.
Yeah.
I also don't think we had the tools. We were using Google Sheets. So,
Yeah, I think there's two things I heard there. One was the tooling wasn't there, but two, it requires like a behavioral and an organizational shift. And that's definitely, I think, a risk with this sort of play, because not every organization wants to ask these questions.
yeah. I joked frequently actually that like I wished we had some sort of unified startup management system that you could just drop top level like financial projections that would just trickle down all the way to like ROI analysis on the product team. Because I felt everything was disconnected. So like if I were trying to, for example, we had a system where we could analyze all of our feature requests, analyze the contract value, and then do ROI analysis on all of the feature requests at the end of the roadmap. But it was hard to take that and then match it towards our like models and projections. And I frequently joke like I wish we could just have this unified, almost like an ERP, which is funny because like we were building an ERP, which is an ERP for the startup that could just like connect everything together.
Have you guys seen Double Loop? I don't know if the name you guys know. You can search Double Loop on Google. It's kind of what you're describing.
Double Loop, oh, right, I've heard of that.
Yes, it's for metrics. So it's like this top-down view, like, hey, like this is the metric for project. Here are the product initiatives
That's a good one.
that are hopefully going to drive it, and you can hopefully like almost like have that causality.
Yes.
Yeah, I have to. How did you guys? You were an input to the FP&A team, right? When you were doing pricing.
Yeah,
What was that
so
like?
we were doing pricing and then did a bunch of biz ops. So we kind of bridged and worked a lot with FP&A. So I was previously at Flexport, was at like 5 years. This was a massive problem, especially like point two, what you were saying. Like when you said a couple of months, we have an initiative that I think spanned probably 6 to 12 months to like get all your metrics aligned.
Yeah.
And the kind of worst issue is when you have a lot of metrics already built out, like rationalization of them and getting them from like 500 dashboards to like the 50 things you should be looking at, and like what is the right revenue metric that